This evening we have a theme in which perhaps the opera is considerably less interesting to us than the great story of which it is a fragment. Musically, the Meistersingers of Nuremberg is a most successful and satisfactory composition. But it involves so many elements that perhaps are not so well known, and the story itself is rather light, not especially substantial, that we have been taught to regard it as a music comedy or an operatic comedy. This term is very successfully applied, largely due to the fact the comedy is carried by one person, the marker, and much depends upon his ability for the humorous situations. Actually, the opera has a number of very serious undertones, and like most great comedy, it must be a combination of involved factors astutely arranged. Now, our primary interest lies in the structure of what we term the German artisan musicians of that period. Head and shoulders above all the others stands the figure of Hans Sachs, whose historical estate, whose factual nature, is worthy of a lot of thought. Wagner actually goes so far as to introduce into his opera some fragments of the original music composed by Hans Sachs. But these fragments have been, of course, adapted by the master musician to his own purposes. Hans Sachs himself stands as by far the dominant figure in a movement which began considerably before his time and extended into the century after his death. And this movement, beneath the surface of the life of Europe, has its roots in a very great antiquity and in very solemn and serious matters. So we want to begin by a little study of this man himself. In the opera, he's introduced as a shoemaker. He was a master of the guild of the shoemakers. We remember another great shoemaker, and that was Jacob Boehme of Görlitz, the famous mystic. And just as Boehme worked both on the soul of the shoe and the soul of man, somewhat a similar situation existed with Hans Sachs. It is not generally known, for example, that Sachs wrote nearly 5,000 poems and over 200 plays. Nor is it generally recognized that he contributed a number of very serious works approaching political and economic problems with the spirit of the guilds. We also know from actual music introduced by Wagner the close affinity of thinking between Sachs and Luther, and that this shoemaker belonged to the great motion of the Protestant Reformation in Germany. Now, Luther was himself a guild man. He belonged to the guild of the watchmakers, and at the time of his famous difficulties with Rome, he was placed under the protection of his guild, which may account for the almost miraculous way in which he escaped the rack and the stake. In those days, something was practiced generally, a principle which descended from antiquity, namely that every citizen of any community, regardless of rank, title, manner of life, had to be an artisan. It was compulsory that every man knew how to make a living. So we find that even the kings belonged to guilds. And the ill-fated Louis XVI of France, even as late as the Revolution, belonged to the Guild of the Clockmakers. And one of the last things that he did before he was led out to execution was to repair the clock in the dungeon where he was kept. This development of an art, craft, or trade as part of the essential life of man goes back to the Greeks and Romans and was an essential principle of medieval Jewish life. Each person must have his trade. So the fact that a man belonged to a guild did not necessarily mean that this represented the extent of his attainments. Now, the guilds themselves have an interesting and important background. These guilds are undoubtedly the descendants of the great family guilds of Greece and Egypt, because in very ancient times, professions, arts, crafts, and trades descended in families. This was also true of medicine, and the first physicians, belonging to the Asclepian cult, were themselves the members of the Guild of the Healing God. The purpose of guilds in those ancient times embraced many of the objectives of the trade unions that were to arise in the 18th and 19th century and the labor unions of today. But if modern labor and labor organizations made more research into the rules and laws of the guilds, we would have very far better labor conditions in this country today. The guild not only protected the workman from exploitation, it protected the employer from exploitation. It also preserved and protected the quality of product, a matter which would be of some interest to many buyers of today. It was the sworn duty of the guildman to mark his wear. His name had to appear, and he was bound and obligated that he could not mark any goods of which he was not proud. And if his goods failed in any way to maintain the quality or to produce the wear that was reasonably expected of it, the man, the guildman, was in disgrace, subject to the penalties of his guild, and very few broke the rule more than once. It was therefore a day in which the guilds, of which Hans Sachs sings so gloriously in the closing scene of the Meistersingers, the glory of the guilds. These guilds were glorious because they represented the glory of honest work, something we have totally forgotten in this time, this day of mechanized products. The glory of the man who made a good pair of shoes, and by that simple fact was entitled, like the ironmonger of King Solomon's legend, to sit beside the king because he made good shoes. In other words, a man did not have to be a doctor or a lawyer or a civil engineer to have the respect of his community. He was respected because he was skilled, and because his honor was beyond question, and because his products were well made. Now, these guilds had many religious overtones, and we know from the story, and it is quite true, that the Guild of the Mastersingers met in the Church of St. Catherine in Nuremberg. Sometimes they met in the cloth hall. Sometimes in less favored communities they met in the alehouse or a room above the inn. It is even known that they met under a tree somewhere. But they were bound. They had their words, their obligations, and a kind of Freemasonic fraternity flourished among them. These guilds belong to what we have called on other occasions, referred to in Parseval, as the Orders of the Quest. They were a non-theological religious body, a body which worshipped by the sacrament of honesty and united their efforts in fraternity and cooperation. Within the structure of the guilds, all men were brothers. Although the guilds had their degrees, promotion and advancement was by merit alone. All guildsmen were entitled to a share in the common good of the community and carried their part of the common burden. They had a ritual which was not definitely different from the Passover or the Lord's Supper. The guild masters gathered with their apprentices and their craftsmen around a table, in the midst of which stood the guild cup, which was the symbol and sign of their movement or their order. And this guild cup was a kind of holy grail, and around the lip of it were hung on hooks tiny shields, each carrying the crest, the name or the insignia of the guild master. When 12 of these masters gathered together around the great guild cup, and each drank together from the same cup, it was a Eucharist, a bond of common integrity, a restatement of an oath of obligation to society, to all things that were great and good and true, and among other things a promise that the apprenticeship system would be maintained and that no one should become a master of that guild until he was worthy, and that to be entered as a master was the highest honor that a man could have within his trade or profession. And on this level he was entitled to the common respect of all mankind. It was among these guilds that we had the first organization to care for the widows and orphans of the deceased guild masters. It was here that unemployment insurance began. It was here that old age pensions were first devised. For it was within the guild that man set up his great protective mechanism of common responsibility. It was also within the guilds that democracy had its earliest and most powerful statement. And long before the political system of Europe permitted the emergence of democracy, it was practiced within the guild group. It was the law of the guild hall, and it was held as a sacred and solemn obligation. Now you can see that groups like this, scattered all over Europe, and particularly centered in Germany, that these groups of wandering or established artisans, each master with his apprentices, for it was not the proper duty of the master to have his secrets die with him. It was his proper duty to see that all the skill of the craft was passed on to those worthy to receive it, who were bound by obligation to in turn demand the same standard of integrity when their time came to pass on the secrets again. And today, after hundreds of years, we do not know and have great difficulty in discovering the secrets of the old bookbinders. the secrets of the early printers. We do not know today the secrets of the medieval tapestry weavers. These things were either lost or have still been handed down within family groups or within very small bodies of people, bound by the same rules as the old guilds. Now, the difference between the typical guild structure and that of the Minnesang or the Meistersinger was that these groups cut right through the guilds, in the sense that in the case of the Meistersingers, they were taken from any and all guilds. They were not reserved to the clothers or the shoemakers or the barbers. They had the right of initiating or accepting members in good standing of all guilds. Thus they became all-over organizations. But by their peculiar level of thinking, they were non-competitive. And the individual who became a Meistersinger was not in conflict with any other guild. Now, the principle that underlies the development of the Meistersingers has to do, perhaps, with the condition of Europe at the time. Actually, most of the members of these groups, and they flourished in several cities in addition to Nuremberg, were square-toed, puritanical persons, solid, honorable masters and craftsmen. They would give the immediate impression of being dour. They lived in comparatively restricted communities. They plied their crafts and trades assiduously. They worked from dawn till dark. It is said that at that day, in those times, a tailor was at his bench from dawn to dark, and frequently far into the night. These men worked hard, and life was not, by any means, the comparatively luxurious state that we enjoy or suffer from today. Actually, these men were artists. They had artistry, because even the barber was an artist, and proud that he gave an outstanding haircut. The baker was an artist, and if you've lived in Europe and seen the way they prepare their breads and cakes and confections, you will know that he is an artist, and his soul went into it. Even the comparatively conventional tailor was an artist, and a shoemaker could be very proud of the fact that he alone could fit a difficult foot with artistry, skill, science, and a resulting product which the owner would be proud to wear. But most of these men were living under a very strict religious, political atmosphere. And among them rose this tremendous pressure, the pressure to release creativity, to go further than the mere trades and professions and crafts in which they were employed. They wanted creative outlet, idealistic outlet. They wanted dream and art. Most of them were what we would call moderately educated. This was not true of the Minnesang that preceded them, for this was composed mostly of nobles and of titled gentry. But many of these good guildsmen had had only maybe 6 months or a year schooling, perhaps less than that. Very few of them had had any formal musical training outside of their own order. A few exceptions existed. But these guildsmen created their own laws and their own ways of music. And they had their book in which the rules, methods, practices of musical composition as they understood it, all these principles were carefully set forth. Now, there's one thing about them that was typically Teutonic and typically contemporary. they were not innovationists. The one thing that they demanded was a strict conformity with traditional rules. As a result of this strange and strict conformity, there was very little great creativity in the music of the Meistersingers. It has not come down to us with the tremendous vitality of a Bach or a Beethoven, not only because these men were trained, but because they were completely inscribed and circumscribed by small rules that almost prevented any creative expression. Wagner himself seems to have made a combination of identifications in his opera. We see in him a man who perhaps in his own day was the greatest rule breaker in the entire world of music. He was a man who opened the way for an almost complete break with many traditional forms of composition and in the development and balance of orchestration and the relation of orchestration to the vocal ensemble. He made many important innovations for which he was severely criticized in his own time. And it is believed that in the character of Beckmesser, the marker, who supplies the principal clowning of the story, that Wagner was aiming directly at a music critic whom he did not personally like, and whose real name appears incidentally in the original score, but was afterwards left out. In other words, Wagner now plays the part of the man, the hero, Walter himself, who dared to break the laws of music, and had persecution and difficulty as a result, but was finally victorious in the spirit of his own high resolution and optimism. So there is a little personal feeling and a little personal sentiment running under the surface of this opera, which carries as one of its messages the break between traditional music and a new era of creative composition, where Wagner felt that he was in a pioneer position. Another interesting sideline to this problem rests in the development of the theme behind the Meistersingers themselves. We all have heard of the Irish and Welsh bards. We know the Orphic rites of Greece with their emphasis upon music. We know about the minstrels and the troubadours. But what we do not seem to recognize or seldom consider is that there are relations between these groups. There is a descent of a great overguild of music, just as there was a descent of a great overguild of architecture. The musical guild did not have quite the same outcome as the architects' guilds, from which came finally the Masonic orders of Europe and America. But the music guilds and the great development of them did have important religious philosophical background. The Minnesang, or the 12 High German poets, was a group that began probably in Provence, where the king was a minstrel, where the court was made up of troubadours, and where a strange, almost Arabian Nights world flourished for a time, and from this same area came the strange, somber, mysterious figure of Michael of Notre Dame, whom we call Nostradamus, who was associated with the court of Provence as personal guide, guardian, and physician to the king René of Provence, who was also at that time king of the Holy Roman Empire. So within this area we find the rise of this guild of musicians, and we have one interesting note about the old Minnesang. These aristocrats of music, perhaps well learned in their various compositions, were called the doleful musicians of unrequited love. Quite a title to carry along through life with you. The Minnesang was notable for sadness. You could always gather with them and weep copiously. Their songs had about them the sadness of hopeless devotion. Actually, we would consider them exceedingly mellow today, because like proverbial tragedy, nothing good ever happened. Everyone was dying of a broken heart in 1, 2, or 3 shops. It was a very sad and melancholy humor that pervaded these times. And the Minnesang was nearly always devoted to these songs, like Walter von Eckenbach, these songs of the worthless, inadequate, miserable, helpless, and hopeless lover, addressing his song to a blessed damoiselle, superior to him beyond approach, so perfect that he could hardly conceive of her existence, and all he could do was to sing this last song and fall dead at her feet. It was a very mellow state of affairs. Now, it was also a very good Christian state of affairs at that time, because these sad singers, whose songs probably paralleled rather closely some of our old hymns in which nothing good ever seems to happen, were not suspected of their real motives. But as in the case of the pre-Raphaelite restoration in England under Rossetti, the Blessed Damoiselle, of course, is the Virgin of the world, Sophia, Mother of Mysteries, Isis, the great World Mother. She is forever that which is beyond human contact. She is Sophia, wisdom, the magnificent truth, the unassailable eternal reality, at the feet of which all men expire, and to which all turn their doleful songs, much as in the sad, heart-rending poetry of the Sufi and the dervishes of Islam. Therefore, this mysterious virgin was the human soul, was the mystery of a religious concept that had descended in Europe from the martyred Albigenses, had come down through the mysterious orders of chivalry, the Comacene masters of Lake Como, went on back to the mysteries of Manes, on through the Gnostics, back still further into Greece and Egypt, the song of man worshipping his own inner soul, the spiritual part of himself, which was indeed for him the bride of the Lamb. This mysterious bride, which is described in Revelation, in which the holy city, adorned as a bride, is united in marriage to the Lamb. This is also, according to the ancient belief, the Mother Church, which is the bride of the Lamb. And under the symbolism of the bride is the acacia, or the sanctuary, the place of those who come to worship, to offer themselves, body and soul, at the feet of the Beloved. Now this, if it had been expressed in good, clean English or German, particularly Low German, would probably have taken everyone to the stake or the rack or the gibbet in those days. But when the troubadours wandered about singing their sad songs, everyone thought they were mad. And that's not so different from the way it is now. If you break with tradition, if you're not content to be a materialist, if you even believe that a human being has a soul, you will probably be adjudged a little strange, even in this enlightened age. But of course there is not much probability that you will be burned at the stake. But your friends may ridicule you for your strange beliefs. The troubadours were actually priests, bishops of the courts of love. The word minstrel means a minister or a priest, although it has gotten very far from that time by the occasion in which it reached the old-fashioned river boats on the Mississippi. But a minstrel man was a priest. A trouvier was a bishop. These bards and singers were the members of secret mystical orders who used these media for the perpetuation of their secret knowledge, much as the alchemists used their chemistry. And the rise of the courts of the rose, the romans of the rose, which is an acrostic, of course, rose being a rearrangement of the letters of the word eros, which means love. So that this mysterious symbol was always present in the rituals of the troubadours, just as it occurs in the final magnificent vision of Dante's Paradiso, in which the heavens unfold upon the petals of 1,000-petaled rose. So the rose became the symbol of the heart. It was the crest sign of Martin Luther. It belonged to the great Reformation that struck Europe, in which authority was to be moved from the church to the heart, and each individual was to raise within himself the matchless altar of his own soul. The courts of love were therefore not places of debauchery, as those who were uninitiated were taught to believe, any more than Omar Khayyam spent most of his time wine-bibbing. These were symbols of the wine of life, and the rose of great love, the rose and the lily. And around the motto of the ancient troubadours was the biblical quotation, the rose of Sharon and the lily of the field. These represented the union of spirit and soul in man, the bringing together of the divine and human in a great Eucharistic mystery, the mystery of a sacrament. So these factors all flowed together to become the underworkings of the guilds. And the guilds took on this sacred destiny of perpetuating the improvement of men. And in the guilds and over the guilds, we find these other organizations that were not limited to a trade or profession, but had free access to many of them, and formed therefore a common meeting ground or a place of common connection. And when the courts of love were called, it was not for amatory reason, but to solve problems of state, to decide the courses of action under the tyranny of the times, and to protect the rights of man from the pressures of a feudal system which still dominated the European mind. Thus we have a new and greater respect for the guilds and all that they stood for when we learn to know them better. And we also have the realization that in these guilds what we call comparative religion already existed. For in many of these guilds there were members of other races. And when the cathedral builders gathered their guilds for the construction of a building, artisans came from as far as India and China to work on the cathedrals of Europe. These guilds were worldwide, and the same marks, the marks of the masters, appear on the Taj Mahal and Qutb Minar in Agra and Delhi as appear on the cathedrals of Europe. These same guilds belong to the order of the Society of Heaven and Earth, the great Chinese guild. And it was this guild that finally produced Dr. Sun Yat-sen, who, although he was a Christian, was also a member of a guild, the Hung Society, the rituals of which were entirely Buddhist and Taoist. But the purpose of the society was the liberation of China. Now this is the same thing that was moving in Europe. The liberation of men, the dignity of labor. the establishment of greater opportunity for human progress and activity. These were the things that men were fighting for the right to be people, to be human beings with minds and hearts and purposes. So through this heavy atmosphere broke the guilds of music, like the Meistersingers. These guilds were an internal release. These artisans found an opportunity to sing, to create, to dream. And their many songs have been preserved for us. Now, when the guilds came to the people in the form of the Meistersingers, a new atmosphere came in. The songs were no longer so dour and dismal. New values were introduced. The songs became more rustic. The songs rose from the people. And the Meistersingers became the audible voice of the German folk. And it is in the glory of the folk that Wagner finds much of his inspiration for the opera. Now, this term folk has come down to us in more recent years in psychology. We're recognizing it almost in the meaning in which it was originally used. Namely, that the total psyche of a people, the psyche which carries the arts, the crafts, the trades, the customs, the dreams, the overtones of a people, that not only do we have individuals with temperaments, but we have the collective temperaments of groups, and some strange mystical atmosphere hovers in the air, or makes the air over Europe. And this atmosphere also is further divided and refined, so that there is an atmosphere that is France, there is an atmosphere that is Italy, there is an atmosphere that is England. And if your eyes are closed, and on a speeding train or plane you cross the boundary of one country to another, you can feel it. What it is, no one seems to be able to say, but it is an intangible atmosphere which represents the total consciousness of an allied group. We are comparatively without the consciousness of folk in the United States, due to the fact that we have derived our people from so many different races, religions, and roots. This perhaps is why we lack, or have not yet built, what might be termed a cohesive spirit. We are still in an age of rugged individualism, in which we no longer, or do not, think of singing of the glory of the group. The folk represents the victory of the group over the individual, but not the tyranny of the group. It represents in a mysterious way the instinctive union of psychological force. The folk gives us the music of a people, the music and the chant, the ritual and the mass. The folk gives us the old songs, the folk songs, that are still nostalgic in our remembrances. There may be many pieces of music, but there are seasons of the year when Old Lang Syne seems to be about the only thing that exactly fits the situation. This is folk. This is the mysterious, intangible power of tradition operating in the life of the individual. Now, tradition may be an obsessing thing when it is not good, but it also has a strange way of binding fragments together, making one out of many. And perhaps this is one of the great mysteries of music, the power to make one out of many. By the participation of the individual member of the choir, something happens musically in the consciousness and experience of the individual. He learns a strange way of expressing collectively, cooperatively, non-competitively. He does his part, and without his part the perfect thing would not be attained. But he does not try to dominate. The purpose is to create the perfect fulfillment of the requirements of the music itself. Those gathered in a great music festival, listening to great artistry, forget race, nation, religion, everything else. They are one in music. And when some extraordinary achievement is made manifest, a vast audience rises as a single individual to herald this achievement. There is a strange, tremendous participation in which not only the performer, but the auditor, in some way becomes a living part of a tremendous tonal pattern, a tonal motion, a vibration in space. And this, to a measure at least, is the story of the folk. And of course, Sachs sings of the glory of the folk. And in his case, it is, of course, the glory of the German people, because Wagner was tremendously conscious of this factor himself. Overconsciousness upon it produced a disaster of Hohenzollern and Hitler. But the principle, as it was expressed through the Meistersingers, would not have produced this disaster of itself, because this was the creative expression of the people, the folk doing collectively something beautiful. Whereas under the pressure and tyranny of dictatorship or autocracy, this pressure became an hypnotic force to produce evil. But in the creativity of the Meistersingers, this was the pattern of release for these men, releasing a creative instinct within themselves. Yet they were not strong enough, because of their time, to break the mysterious power of rules, regulations, by means of which they were musically confined and restricted. Another important phase of the story of this group has to do with the mysticism of the old Meistersingers. You can get very little information about the inner workings of these groups, but by studying a few of the prominent texts that have descended to us from the troubadours and some of their contemporaries, we realize that these groups were divided roughly, the Meistersinger definitely, into 3 grades, which corresponded to an apprentice, a craftsman, and a master. In this case, the grades were divided according to the achievement of the artist. One grade consisted of those who could write the words of a musical composition, but not the music. The second grade consisted of the individual who could write the music to another man's words. And the third, or highest grade, the master, was the one who could write both the words and the music, thus representing levels of achievement. The poetry of the Meistersingers was exceedingly conservative, and in one of the simplest forms of verse composition that we know. They were not skilled in poetry. They only were able to maintain certain elementary poetic rhythms, and they would never for a moment have departed therefrom. If you go back, however, to the Greeks, you will realize that another great tradition descended within the structure of poetry alone, and that poetry was divided from prose by the very pronouncement of the Oracle of Delphi, which stated that prose was the language of men and hexameter verse the language of the gods. So all things which had to do with sacred matters were originally placed in poetry as being symbolic of a rhythmic motion of words. Words as ritual, words as mantram, words as a combination of sounds and motions and rhythms in an effort to convey over meaning through rhythmic organization. So the songs, the mystical parts of the stories, were placed in verse, and the appropriate masters, if necessary, compiled the music, or prepared it, composed it, for the use of the poets. And in France, of course, we had the great rise of the French Pléiade, or the Pleiades, the great cluster of French poets under Ronsard. And this group of poets was up to its neck in politics, fighting like Francois Villon for the invisible empire of the beggars. And we think of him only as a ruler over outcasts. But this is far from the truth, because the great courts of the troubadours and trouviers were held in the sewers of Paris, because it was here that the humble, the meek, who should inhabit the earth, were called to their labors. All these things were tied together in a very strange and wonderful way, and they moved together into the great era of reformations, in which finally, after the development of the Western Hemisphere, after the destruction of the Spanish Armada, and many other things, the rise of liberalism became possible. And we had the era of revolutions, which resulted ultimately in the establishment of the democratic way of life on a political level. But all of this was pressed forward by thousands of years of conditioning. Men do not change overnight. Democracy was not achieved by the signing of a paper, but by the gradual development of instincts within the folk of people, within the souls of people. For only when the soul is prepared can it carry the burden of decision. Until then, it is not strong enough to speak and have its words heard and understood. Now, there is no evidence of any great or profound symbolism under the basic story of the Master Singers as we know it. There are intimations that Wagner was telling a symbolic account. But this symbolism is almost only pointing up the basic theme of the Master Singers themselves. It is inviting you to look up the major theme, not merely to be satisfied with the story. The story is extremely simple. It has to do with this group of solid citizens, and in the first part of the opera we find them gathering in the Cathedral Church of St. Catherine in order to have their regular and proper meetings. Here we are introduced to the venerable, beloved, all-wise Merlin of the group, Hans Sachs. Here we also come to know other members of this rather august body, dignified, majestic, with the simplicity of the shoemaker, the barber, the baker, and the tailor. And yet in this circle they were all of consequence, and no royal court could have gathered with greater decorum. We also find that in this community was another guild, which is represented in our story by a wealthy goldsmith. Now, of course, the guild of the goldsmiths was certainly handling rare and precious materials and demanded great artistry, as we know from the reputation of Cellini and others under the great wing of the Medici, the great and skillful workers in precious metals. Now, the prominent citizen, the fine member of the gold makers, or the gold workers guild, had a daughter, Eva, and he was a little concerned with local conditions. He had looked around among the rich burghers from whom he might hope to select a son-in-law, and was complaining and generally upset by the fact that he did not feel that local conditions were quite in order. The honor, the dignity of certain professions was apparently failing a little. These rich merchants and neo-nobles, where he might have sought, did not live up to his standard of a proper husband for his beautiful daughter. So gradually this conspiracy developed, with her consent, ultimately, that she would marry the winner or victor in the great competition of the Meistersingers. In other words, whoever was awarded the wreath and chain of victory would then be entitled to have her hand. The young lady, however, put a proviso on it, namely that she could refuse to marry the individual. But if she did, she promised she would marry no one. So it was either the Meistersinger or an old maid. So naturally, she was considerably concerned with the outcome of this particular competition that was soon to take place. Now, into this situation wanders a young Franconish knight whose name is Walther, and his background is a little mysterious because he is supposed to have been qualified. He studied under a great master of the old Meistersingers, but this master had been dead for a very long time, and no one was quite sure of the rules that this other master had established, and to which the young man must theoretically conform. It was not possible to know just how to judge him because of his remote connections. Also in this situation, we have another interesting dating problem going back to Wagner himself. This so-called comedy opera came to Wagner's attention as a theme, and he began to develop it about 1845. At this time, he was just completing Tannhäuser. And this was important because in Tannhäuser we have actually a fragment of the Minnesang, the older musical group which preceded the Meistersingers. So strangely, these two operas are intimately associated. And in Tannhäuser we see, in the Venusberg sequences and things of that nature, fragments of the old initiation rites of the troubadours. A situation that perhaps has not always been given the attention that it should. But here we find, on the level of the Minnesang, a much higher, more mystical, and more profound level of meaning and interpretation. But in any event, young Walther, who is the hero of the Meistersingers, obviously, inevitably, naturally, and operatically falls in love with the leading lady. That is a coincidence that can almost always be depended on. The hero nearly always becomes enamored of the heroine. There is, however, a mysterious interference here that becomes the basis, really, of the comedy factor in the story. And that is Beckmesser, the Maker, the man who is the scorekeeper, so to say, and who has the right to decide whether or not one of the competitors, or any of the competitors, has kept a sufficient number of the rules to win the contest. Now, in their method of tabulating, they used a tabulator, or a group of ordinances upon which they based all of their findings. And instead of adding points to build a score, you build a score by reducing the number of points marked against you. It is a little bit like the story of golf, where the low score rather than the high score wins. Because the low score in this case means that there have been fewer errors or variations from the traditional form. Every time the singer-poet broke the slightest rule of the tabulator or the list of inflexible and invariable principles that must be kept, a mark was put against him. And if a certain number of marks were put against him, he could not be a master, at least not with that composition. He would have to wait and try again. Now, Beckmesser was an elderly, roguish character who becomes the foil. He is the clown, because he has a most excellent estimation of himself, and although he is not quite in romantic years, he also has his attention directed toward Eva, the daughter of the rich goldsmith. And he can see no reason why his rather ungainly personality should not be the winner. This causes him not only to perform a number of exceedingly clownish and ridiculous actions, but also to take a particular malice against young Walther, whom he recognizes as a potential rival in this situation. So as the Merker, he has the right to make every possible criticism that he can think of in an effort to prevent the young man from winning his position of master within the group of singers. And of course in the opera we see the Merker behind his screen or behind his little table with a curtain, and every time he can possibly find a fault in Walther's singing, there is great commotion and agitation behind the table, and with great ceremony the debit is marked against the young man. Everything that's possible is done to annoy him, and Beckmesser becomes a very amusing character, especially if well played. But in opera you have to be fortunate to get a voice that can also be a good comedian, so sometimes much of the comedy is lost. But there is where it is essentially located. Now in this same situation, of course, we find Hans Sachs, an elderly widower, a kindly, good man, who perhaps also had some aspirations to find in Eva a possible second wife. And because he was such a fine man, although he was rather elderly to be romantic, it is quite possible she would have favored him, had not young Walther come along and captured her heart. But of course Sachs is the philosopher, the venerable, kindly man, so when he sees the way things are, he's a little sad, and Wagner explains his sadness in a series of very beautiful songs, but he immediately goes to work to help the young couple to solve their problem and to get together. He is not selfish. Merker attempts to sing his love song to the window of his beloved. Hans Sachs starts pounding with his hammer on these shoes, creating such a din that the poor Merker does not know what he's doing. And finally, Beckmesser goes and complains, and Hans Sachs says, "But it's your shoes I am mending. You have said you must have them, and quickly. So you're going to have them quickly." Poor Beckmesser then says, "Well, don't have them now, because I'm trying to sing." But Sachs says he has to do the shoes. It's part of the deal. So finally they arbitrate. Hans Sachs says that he will not nail the shoe except when Beckmesser makes a mistake in his music, and Sachs will play the part of the Merker and mark down the errors. And of course it so develops that the errors are almost continuous, and before the song is nearly finished, the entire pair of shoes has been repaired because of the number of mistakes. Poor Beckmesser is by this time nearly hysterical. He jumps up and down, shouts and screams, and acts in a manner appropriate to the comedy relief of the situation. The story unfolds in this way through the simple activities of the people of the community. And there is the gradual integration of these great so-called prize songs, which young Walter is said to have received in a dream. There is some temporary misunderstanding between Eva and Hans Sachs, but this is cleared up, and the scene more or less moves around the house of the kindly cobbler or shoemaker. And young Walter, before the next competition, which is to take place, sings parts of his song to Hans Sachs in the shop. And Sachs very carefully makes notations on a piece of paper of certain things that he thinks are particularly fine. And young Walter will not sing the climax of his song, because he says that he will only sing when he is doing it for the competition. So the young man goes off to get dressed to go out and join the parade of the guildsmen, and in the interlude of a comparatively quiet stage, Meister comes in and sees the manuscript with the notes of Hans Sachs laying on the table. He looks at it, and he sees that it is a musical composition. He does read music well enough to know that it is excellent, and he immediately decides to appropriate it for himself. So he slips the manuscript leaves in his pocket, and about this time Hans Sachs comes in. And Meister begins to deride Hans Sachs for having written a love song, and insists that he is going to try, as this cobbler is going to try to take Eva away from him, Meister, at the competition. Sachs does not know what it's all about. It's a complete mystery to him until he notices that the manuscript is missing. Then the thing clears instantly. So Sachs assures Meister that he is not going to compete, that he's not going to take Eva away from him. In fact, he's not even going to sing the song. And under these conditions, he will even let Meister sing it for him, so that Meister can have this song, which almost certainly should win the fair lady. Well, now Meister is jumping up and down in glee. He is almost hysterical for joy now. His peculiar fitting clothes, which are exaggerated for the occasion, are sticking out in all directions, and he is just like a jumping jack out of sheer joy at this situation. So he now feels almost certain that he's going to win. But of course old Hans Sachs knew the facts, knew exactly how it was going to turn out, and was not much concerned over the entire problem. And then of course comes a delightful scene on the banks of the river outside of the city of Nuremberg. Here we find the guilds gathering, and there are great parades, and Wagner introduces a delightful chorus with a waltz, which had not been invented at the time, by the way, but that doesn't interfere with the high drama any more than the introduction of a clock's striking is notable in the play of Julius Caesar, in which clocks did not exist, but that is a poetic or dramatic license. But you have an interesting scene in the last act of the Meistersingers where the guilds parade in. And this is really, they come in with their banners and their various brilliant costumes and all the equipment and all the festivities of the occasion. They make grand march and everything, and they form a great ring of people. And the villagers are all there, and the children are all there, and theoretically, if not factually, the local animals are all there. It is the great day. Everyone turns out. And in the midst of this, of course, the rich burghers appear, including the goldsmith and his beautiful daughter, and they have a stand, or sort of a grandstand, up stage left, where they sit to watch what is happening. And everyone is in a very festive and wonderful mood. And in the midst of all of this festivities, Meister decides that it is his opportunity to sing the song that is going to win for him the fair Eva. He's only made 2 or 3 slight errors, however. One thing, he forgot to memorize it, so that he does not really know the song. In fact, he got it so recently, he had very little time to do anything with it. The second thing was that he had not learned how to unite the words and the music. And he was in a pretty bad state by the time he started to try to sing this. And so with the notes at which he is peering at most unfortunate moments, and which he is reading in wrong arrangement, he sort of cries and shouts and gurgles and gargles, but very little comes out that is of any value musically. And before he gets through, the entire group of persons around, all the judges and everyone else, are laughing uproariously at him, ridiculing him, and he is informed that he has not only broken all the rules that there are in the tabulator, but he has broken rules that were never up to that time invented even, so that he is in total and complete disgrace. Now actually, young Walther is not a master of the order because his first effort had failed, and theoretically he was not entitled to compete at this time. But through the intercession of Hans Sachs, who is always there to do things, Sachs explains that Beckmesser had badly misused the music composed by another person. Therefore, that in fairness to the composition and all concerned, that the true author should be permitted to present his melody and to be judged accordingly. That actually it was not fair otherwise that the thing should be. So in due course, young Walther stands out on the little mound in the middle of the stage where the master singer sings his number and sings his prize song. And at the end of the prize song, the music, although it is not quite traditional, Hans Sachs saves the situation by pointing out certain values and pointing out throughout that perhaps this music must be measured by its own internal laws and not simply by the rules in a book. That there is another kind of rule, the rule within the structure of music. And that if this rule is kept, if the real and great rules of harmony are preserved, that there may be other catalogues of values by which these things should be determined. Of course, Hans Sachs has such a venerable position that no one really wants to go against him, so he is accepted, his conclusion is accepted, and Walther, of course, is pronounced the winner. He receives the wreath, but refuses the chain which goes with it because of the previous rebuff at the time of his first musical appearance before the Meistersingers. When he refuses this honor, Hans Sachs speaks to him and tells him that he must not refuse, that he must recognize that there were rules which he did not keep, that the new situation that arose and the honor that these people now wish to convey upon him, he should accept in proper and gracious spirit. And as long as he is also getting Eva in the bargain, he decides that that is the best thing to do. It is then that Hans Sachs sings his great song on the glory of the guilds and of the folk, telling not only the story of the Meistersingers and all that they stood for and the great trade unions of Germany, but prophetically warning of the dangers that lay ahead for the country when these great unifying factors were no longer venerated and admired. This is such a moving song that at the end of it, Walther takes the wreath of the winner from his own head and places it on that of Hans Sachs. There is general and complete rejoicing. The goldsmith is satisfied with his new son-in-law, and everything ends on a note of very constructive and happy circumstances. This is approximately the story of the opera. There are the details, the apprentices and so on, but they do not add much to the color of the story. Here then we have the remnant of the old Minnesäng. Walther is actually singing this song to win his bride. And while the contrivance is a little different from the older contrivance, again, Eva represents the soul toward which the great song is sung. Again, Hans Sachs is old Gurnemanz of Parsifal. He is Merlin, the wise man. He is the counselor. He is the old way of wisdom. He is the initiator and the guide and the leader in this curious adventure which is to befall. Young Walter is again the hero of the world. He is the one who is to win his own soul through fair and reasonable competition, to be judged by a jury of his kind, and is to earn his right to be included within the great circle of the Master Singers. The Master Singers, of course, representing mature human beings, the citizens of the tribe or nation, the responsible persons in society to which the individual must earn, in which he must earn his place. And I think we have another interesting phase of this which comes down to us from old times, and that is that these degrees, the 3 degrees of the Master Singers order, and the 3 steps of the Guild Builders order, all relate to the essential values of citizenship in the ancient tribe of peoples. In antiquity, man was never born into citizenship. He had to earn it. He was always advanced through 3 stages, from childhood to adolescence, from adolescence to maturity. In childhood, he was the one who wrote the poem but could not write the music. In adolescence, he wrote the music, but not the words. But in maturity, he wrote both the music and the words. In other words, he combined the soul, or the musical factor, the spiritual or invisible, with the words, which represented the outer forms of things. Thus he became the complete builder of a compound structure of spirit and body, represented by the song and the words. In ancient times, young people, both boys and girls, had to pass through certain tests before they could become citizens. These tests are contrived or preserved to us to some degree in the examinations of a university. Here again, committee is appointed. The individual is assigned certain responsibilities and duties. These he must perform. But in the old times, these initiation rites usually represented 3 important steps. First, in childhood, he had to practice obedience and learning. In adolescence, he had to develop skill and knowledge. And in maturity, he had to accept responsibility. These were the degrees of his order. And when the time came for him to compete, to be a master, that is, to become a full-fledged citizen, it was necessary for him to prove achievement. No one was permitted in ancient society to full citizenship in his clan, in his tribe, in his state, or in his nation until he could bring to that society a proven skill by means of which he could contribute to the well-being of the group. No individual at that time belonged to a leisure class. There wasn't any. No individual was permitted to live off of the group. No individual was permitted to live only by barter and exchange within the group. And this was an important rule of the Essene sect in Syria and the Lebanon. Every citizen must be a creative producer. He must actually contribute a positive and purposeful, useful trade or craft to the security of the group. So his initiation ended with his proof under trial, his ability to prove that he was a master. Until he could prove this, he could not sit in the council of his elders, nor could he make rules or participate in any legislation, nor could he pass ballot or vote. He could have no authority until he had passed his examination. And by this examination, he convinced his elders that they could depend upon him to be a useful creator making a positive contribution to the physical well-being of his group. This record concept was carried also in the story of the Meistersingers. But now we have a new dimension coming. The guilds, the clothers, the tailors, the barbers, the merchants, the hatters, all of these groups contributed something to the comfort, security, protection, and efficiency of life. But there was something else. A man lives not by bread alone, nor with a good pair of new shoes alone. Because a man may have all the comforts and commodities of life and still be unhappy. He can still be frustrated, and he can be without internal equilibrium, in internal well-being. So the Minnesang and later the Meistersingers came in as the overguild in which individuals had to prove the maturity of the soul. Now this was a very important thing. And in these guilds, the maturity of the soul was proved on the level of music. In other words, if the individual could by instinct and nature produce beauty, his soul was good. He did not have to know music, technically. Because instinctively, if he was an integrated being, he would combine tone in a way, simply because he could not endure it any other way himself. If, however, his instincts were not mature, if his psychic discrimination was not developed, he would not notice inharmony, or would accept it without question, or would not discriminate. And his condition, of course, is intimated in the case of Beckmesser, who never knew that he was no good. But if the individual instinctively moves in harmonic pattern, you have something that is very important, and I think we come across it strongly and dramatically in Oriental art. You do not have to be an artist to understand art, but you have to have a soul. You do not have to be a musicologist to enjoy music, but you will find that as you become accustomed to music, your taste will change. You will become more and more capable of appreciating music which at one previous time was beyond your comprehension. You will find that your taste for good music gradually unfolds, and you will also know why certain great composers have lived, even though you might not instinctively react to them. Ultimately, the musical maturity of a people elevates its musically great to the state and the condition to which they are entitled. And great musicians, gradually unfolding their own internal consciousness, come to certain common agreement as to what constitutes true greatness. In this way, the Minnesang and the Meistersingers became the soul artisans. They had to do with the release of the overtones in human nature, man's creativity on a psychic level. The individual is never completely creative if he labors only with his hands. The work of his hands is necessary and needed by his people. But a civilization without poets will never mature, and a culture without philosophers will die. There must be these overtones, and the stout, solid burghers of Germany experience this tremendous need for overtone. We experience it today, but we do not know what to do about it. We realize that our materialism is not correct, and most of us are desperately lacking in the opportunity for psychic creativity. We are no longer capable of doing things with the wonderful ingenuity which marked the habits and practices of our ancestors. Perhaps there is no place where this is more obvious, no time than right now at Christmas. 100 years ago, very few people ever bought a gift. It would have been regarded as something almost a disgrace. Today, very few people make one. Also, today, very few people who would make one and give it would be appreciated. Because today we live in a world of store-bought fineries of all kinds. And unless it is machine-made, we do not consider it to be good. We're a little ashamed of the things we make with our own hands. And yet, because we are so deprived, there is rising all over the world craft shops, backyard carpenter shops, little neighborhood activities where individuals make things, do things themselves because of the great and pressing need for human expression. The expression that no individual can have unless he recognizes, as Sachs tells us in one of his prose works, that no man, no human being is mature unless he expresses through himself the divine impulse to create. He must make something. He must fashion it. He must put it together. And most of all, he must have and create dreams. He must have visions within himself. He does not need to be a visionary person, but he must be a person with vision. He must have an opportunity to release beauty. Draw, paint, sing, play. He must do these things himself. Sitting at the piano with one finger of each hand and trying to work out some simple melody means more in creativity within the individual than the purchase of $500 worth of symphonic records which he can listen to and do nothing. No, he does not mean that he shouldn't listen. But there is a strange victory in the doing. And it may be so badly done that no one will enjoy it but you. And the neighbors will hope you move. And yet inside of yourself, the thing that you do is yours. The thing that you only listen to or watch somebody else do is not yours. And this was the spirit behind the Meistersingers, that these people had to release soul through action. We have to. And the soul is harmony, order, number. The soul is rhythm, pattern, design. And it is the soul in man which, coming forth, resolves to make the world beautiful. And in this struggle toward beauty, we find many degrees, many limitations, many barriers. But the bursting through of the soul of a people, in its art and in its culture, announces the maturity of that people. Thus the glory of the folk is expressed through the glory of the guilds, the creative bands of artisans who worship through work and who honor God through creativity, through becoming themselves creators of beauty. Therefore today, every modern person bound within a circle of humdrum experiences should have this creative outlet by decision, by choice, by the recognition of necessity. He should make things with his hands. He should dream things. He should learn to express the inner psychic power of his own nature. And perhaps today that is why we have so many organizations now springing up, weavers. And the effect of weaving alone upon the restoration of health among battle fatigue victims is tremendous. Weaving for backward children has shown that creativity, to do something, releases power. the making of pottery, the designing of fabrics, the making of furniture. All of these things are perhaps not too important in term end of production, but they are tremendously important in helping man to break through the mechanical routine of life, which carries him from the cradle to the grave without self-expression, without self-satisfaction of instinct. Where this neurotic pressure of limitation settles upon the individual, his health, his character, his affability, all these things suffer. So perhaps we need the guilds back. Perhaps we need the simple rituals of the guilds and the tremendous experience of ritualism. Because ritualism is again a union in action, like the cyclic dances of the ancient Greeks. The dance again is the union of man and motion. And this is a tremendous experience. This is why so much emphasis was placed upon it by the Orphics, and also by the Muslim mystic Jalaluddin, who declared that the rhythms of the body, if brought into harmony with the rhythms of the universe, represent a kind of illumination, a tremendous psychic experience of motion. In India, we have the mantram and the mudra. The mudra is a hand posture, traditionally as old and as restrictive as any of the rules on the tabulator of the Meistersingers. A simple hand posture to sustain a mood, to sustain an attitude. The mudra is always the expression of an internal, realized truth. And if this realized truth takes a certain form, the hand is placed in a certain posture, or is moved in relationship to the body. Now imagine how simple a thing a gesture is. It is about the most elementary motion we can make. And yet the simple fact that we place the hand in the symbolic posture of an idea will support that idea 100-fold, simply because physical action has been brought into harmony with purpose. The individual has done something. And the simple control of his body, so that the mind causes action, is most important, because no attitude, no inner conviction, no belief, no vision, no inspiration is complete until it is geared to action of some kind, either real or symbolical. So the shoemaker with his last gives the action, and the song of the master singer is the psychic overtone, which united with that action produces the compound of inner and outward activity meeting. And this compound is the secret of the vital perpetuation of life. Life cannot be perpetuated by thought alone, nor by action alone, nor by feeling alone. But when thought or feeling move into action, there is life, there is activity, there is a vibration set in motion that can never end. So these two levels became part of the German folk. And it is true in other nations also. The musical instruments involved, whether in China, India, Greece, or Egypt, are always designed from one of two things: either the human body or the mathematical formula of the universe, one or the other. The Veena, the magnificent instrument of the gods in India, contains within its proportions and dimensions the whole structure of the solar system. So does the simple little moon lute of the Chinese. The Orphic lyre is also the solar system with its planets. And all of the instruments that are used in music are mathematically based upon universal law, because without such law there can be no harmony. So harmonic sound, harmonic interval, has a tremendous ministry in itself. because it relates to the vibratory principles of the universe. The individual who can compose and combine melody and lyric has a knowledge subconscious within himself that is very important to him, and has an experience from this union which is the same as the marriage of the sun and moon in the mystery of alchemical transmutation. Therefore, the sun and the moon, the music and the word, combining together give life. All of these principles were originally part of music. And if you'll go back to the Greeks, you will realize that in their time, the laws of music were so strictly and rigorously held that the state could pass rulings upon them. Any musician or composer in Greece was required to list his composition with the archons, or the judges of the city. The music, when played, was judged by the masters of the music arts. And if this musical composition was regarded as detrimental to the security of the state, the composer could be exiled and the music could be forbidden to be played, upon pain of punishment even to the degree of death. The Greeks were taking no chance with bad music. They simply did not believe in it. Pythagoras, wandering through a Greek city, was able to strike the keynote of architecture with his lute. And Pythagoras believed and taught that every piece of structure that man raises, from a three-legged stool to the most elaborate cathedral, is actually a musical composition. That it can be transformed into sound equivalent, can be played. And an antithetical chord can be found, which, if struck, will destroy the whole building, bringing it down as the trumpets brought down the walls of Jericho in the biblical story. Caruso, of course, was able to break a tumbler by singing its keynote, and there have been many such experiences recorded. But the Greeks believed definitely that in the musical modes there was an entire universe of knowledge, that these modes could change the moods and characters of human beings, that there were modes for healing, that there were modes for religious ceremony, just as there was architecture. In Greece, the temples of each order of deities were different architecturally, and no deity of one order was worshipped in the building of another, because it was declared that the veneration pattern created in the mind of the worshipper, if it was not in harmony with the architecture of the building, destroyed the pattern of reverence. These people were very particular about such matters. The same was true of their music. There was music for every occasion, as there is with primitive man. And today there are hundreds of drum rhythms in Africa, a drum rhythm for every mood of the human soul. And as these drums are beaten, the actual heartbeat is altered. And by changing the heartbeat, we change the rhythm of the drum of Shiva, the great musical instrument of India, for they believe that the pulsing of the heart is the basis of all drum rhythms. Because under various moods the heartbeat changes, as the Chinese know. And from these simple observations our entire theory of drum rhythms developed. Also now we know that these rhythms can in turn react upon the heart. And we wonder sometimes what certain kinds of modern music will do. Can we assume that these tonal patterns, harmonic and anharmonic, with which we are constantly confronted, have no effect upon us? The Greeks would have said these musical compositions can build and destroy a culture. They can create a world or tear it down because of their effect upon the subconscious psychic life of the individual in the realms of vibration. So these sciences were taught in the ancient guilds of music. The responsibility of the musician to the world in which he lived. His composition had to be played before an order of his masters. He was not permitted to give music to the world until it was tested, until the masters of his order were satisfied that he had kept the rules of good music, and that he was giving nothing that could hurt anyone. The therapeutic value of music in the modern world is being recognized. Gradually we shall develop the science of this until we know how to treat a variety of infirmities by this means alone. The Meistersingers did not know this, but they could treat one infirmity, and they did it very nicely, and that was the infirmity of frustration. They were able to release themselves. They had the glorious experience of finding in their music the power that made them better husbands, better fathers, better sons. That they found a release from the burden and responsibilities of daily living, and an open door into a world of creativity where all men are equal, and where the beauty and the glory of life can be sung as it is sung by the bird and by all creatures that naturally adore their Creator. So there was great religion, great sensitivity in these musical guilds. And as time went on, they have gradually disappeared from among us. And in their place we have what we call the art of music today. This art of music has no merca. It has no rules. It has gone from the overburdening of laws to the absence of laws. Today, each individual who is an innovationist believes he is a creator. But somewhere there should be a merca, perhaps a little wiser and better one than Beckmesser, but still someone or something that reminds us that with sound we create and with sound we destroy. With sound we pick up the sorrowing heart. With sound we tear down the strength of nations. With sound we can heal neurosis, and with sound we can create neurosis. With sound we can produce brainwashing, as it is produced in Russia. With sound we can lift man up to the elevation of an apatheistic condition, as in the celebration of the High Mass, and in some of the magnificent compositions that we know in the world of great music, such as, for instance, one that I particularly like, and that is the Mass of Palestrina. These musical things, these wonderful tonal patterns and pictures, tell us of the secret tradition in music, and how the musicians themselves, instinctively or otherwise, seem to touch and move in upon a world of unseen powers and values. In Wagner we have one of these tremendous creative forces. We have in Wagner perhaps one of the most amazing unfoldments of the music of the people. The sense of music as the stirring power of the traditional soul in man. In Wagner, music releases through man the old, the deep, the ancient, the folk in himself. It brings to the surface of him the legend, the fairy tale, the myth, and the allegory. It brings forward out of the ancient atavistic life he has lived the long, strange, locked story of himself. In Wagnerian music, the subconscious, the unconscious part of man suddenly merges toward the surface. It unlocks strange, deep mysteries. Perhaps this is one of the reasons it has had such a strange, almost demoralizing effect upon German consciousness for a long time. But it also unlocks the temples and gates of the old mysteries. It brings back the pageantries of long ago. It establishes the leitmotif theory, which is the one in which every value in life has a musical design. And from these key designs, every great melodic compound and harmonic compound is built until we are confronted with the universe itself as a magnificent symphonic composition composed of all the motives of every living thing blended into one magnificent choral mass. All these things we sense in Wagner, and we sense that perhaps he was an heir to the ancient troubadours. There is much to indicate that he knew their technique and their work. Perhaps he also was singing to his invisible and unknown mistress, the Virgin of the world. And he restores the old ways. He is the one great geographical misfit in music. He does not belong in that great unfoldment of the three B's that we hear so much about. He belongs rather in a strange medieval pageantry of an age of chivalry or an age of mysteries and rites and ceremonies. And through his music, some of the greatest surviving rituals of music drama are preserved for us. And in these we are very grateful to him. But we must not be overwhelmed by him. We must also recognize that in this torrent of release there must be organization. What each individual must do is realize that if he ever opens the strange Pandora's box of his own internal, he must be prepared with skilled hands and an open mind to use this power. He must have creativity, for release from within himself must have skilled creativity to direct it. So every man must, before he seeks to grow and know, must have the skill in his hands, the skill in his mind, the dedication in his heart, to use what pours through him constructively. If he does not do this, then he definitely perverts or misuses the tremendous resource that he has. Operas tell us much of this. The opera experience is something for the thoughtful. It is not true that music is for privileged classes, nor for leisure classes, nor for a few connoisseurs or musicologists. Music is for all men, and those need it most, whose other outlets are most limited. And in the gradual growth of music appreciation within the consciousness of man, we have one of the most maturing, enriching forces operating in society today. And this is about all we can do with our little series of 5 talks. We hope they have been helpful, that you have enjoyed them, and we take this opportunity of wishing you all the season's greetings in case we shouldn't see you again until after Christmas. And thank you.